Throughout this unit, we've been looking at industrialization and its effects on Europe. Today, we're going to kind of expand our view and see how European and eventually Western industrialization ended up affecting the globe. We've already seen how Europe, starting in England, transitioned from life on small farms with a very agricultural sort of based economy to an industrial based economy centered in cities based on factory production. We've seen how this transition to industrialization began in Great Britain and then spread to different parts of Europe and the United States, and then eventually Japan. And it changed a lot more than just how people made what they need. Steam power and capitalism drove this revolution, and both had pretty big effects on the societies that experienced them. In the short term, the working class suffered. And as a result of the costs in terms of their lives and livelihoods, child labor, low wages, poor health, pollution, etc., several different economic theories began to be proposed, including socialism and communism. We also saw labor unions form on the business level as a way of workers to try to organize to get better working conditions. Meanwhile, we've also seen how the Industrial Revolution completely changed power, transportation, and communication, and eventually led to huge advances in science and technology that accelerated. The steam engine, for example, facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas through powering railroads and steamships, which sped the pace of human transport and communication and cultural diffusion, and it increased the reach of the power of government to areas that would have been isolated before. Meanwhile, advances in science, medicine, and the social sciences led to an improved quality of life and longer lifespans for some. I say for some because there are definitely parts of the world that paid the cost of these advancements. And that part of the story has a lot to do with something called imperialism, which is what we're about to study now. A brief overview is that Western nations seeking raw materials to fuel industrial production launched a new wave of imperial conquests, carving up most of the globe amongst themselves. Eventually, the system of competition for imperial power to have the biggest colony and the biggest empire between the great powers of Europe, so the big, strong, industrialized states of Europe, and the industrial capacity to mass produce weapons of increasing lethality, like the machine gun, would eventually lead to one of the most devastating wars in history, the First World War. On the connection between imperialism and World War I, the steam engine and the Maxim machine gun helped spread the tidal wave of European imperialism that swept across Africa, Asia, much of the world throughout the part of the 19th century, the late 19th century. The technologies of the Industrial Revolution opened up new horizons of conquest and led to the European competition for dominance, which was one of the main causes of the outbreak of World War I. So that global part of the story is where we're going now. And we're going to start by talking just basically about what imperialism is, what it was like, what forms it took, followed by what caused it and how it played out in different parts of the world. The kind of empire building that happened when industrialized nations dominated non-industrialized nations to extract raw materials for economic gain, following capitalism's profit motive in order to fuel their industrial production even further, is what's called new imperialism. So this is part of the story of empires rising and falling that we've seen throughout world history, but it's different in its connection to industrialization and capitalism. We can connect it to our discussion on inequality prompted by industrial capitalism, in that we've already seen how capitalism increased inequality between social classes, between the working class, the people who worked for wage labor, and the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois, the capitalist class, the owners of the means of production, the machines. Now we're going to see how it led to a different kind of inequality between states in terms of power and their capacity to fuel industrial production in their economies that way. Imperialism really just means the act of creating an empire. And in this context, we're going to be looking at its connection to industrialization and how it played out. First, let's look at this map. I'm going to let it run a few times so you can really see the rise and fall of empires over the years. Look in particular at Africa first. Now we're looking at the fall of empires around 2008. And here's right around when Columbus made it to Americas, the colonization of the Americas, followed by the revolutions that cost those colonies. Keep your eye on Africa. You'll see a huge change around 1800. And you'll see that European states transitioned from having colonial holdings in the Americas, and then after they lost them, their attention shifted to Africa. And they conquered the entire continent with amazing speed. Next, look at Asia. I'm going to let it cycle through one more time. So starting 1492, 1550, keep your eye on Asia. Around the Industrial Revolution now, you'll see colonial holdings increase again. This is the story that we're going to tell. How did a tiny part of the world, in relation to the others, conquer basically everything as a result of industrialization? Why would they do this? How did they justify it to themselves? And at what cost? Who paid the price? You can probably guess. One really great way of seeing history when stand-up comedians do it well is through the eyes of stand-up comedians. And so I have to recommend actually a special by Trevor Noah called Afraid of the Dark to understand kind of what imperialism really meant in practice. He does a great job of getting you to imagine the strangeness of this concept, which we've given a name, and so it sounds normal now. So I'm not going to try to do the stand-up part, and his version is hilarious, and it includes a lot of dialogue that I can't replicate. But I'm going to read it to you like a source. And while I do, I'd like you to think about the connection between nationalism and imperialism and why it's such a weird thing to want to do. Trevor Noah writes, "I'll never forget that moment when Donald Trump closed the lead, had a 1 in 2 chance of being president of the United States. And it's not just America. A lot of Americans were shocked by his rhetoric, but if you expanded your view, you realize that the rise of nationalism is taking place all over the world. In Austria, in Australia, in England. That was what Brexit was all about, right? They made it seem like it was about the economy, but it wasn't. The truth was, it was fundamentally people who wanted their country back. It never went anywhere, but they still wanted it back. I saw people on the news talking to the BBC. That's why I'm voting for Brexit, right? Because this bloody country is going to the dogs. That's why we voted for Brexit, because we want Britain back. From who? From who? Britain is like 95% white. Who do you want it back from? People say the weirdest things. These bloody immigrants, they come over here, they're up to no good. I hate these bloody immigrants. They need to go back where they came from. Why do you hate them so much? I'll tell you why I hate them. Because they're not even trying to be British. That's why. They don't even try to be British. They come here, they bring their bloody culture, they bring their own food, spit their own bloody languages, try to take the whole bloody place over. That sounds pretty British to me. If there's one country in the world that has no right to complain about immigration, it's Great Britain. You do understand, they created the problem that they are now dealing with. They went out and colonized the world. At one point, half the globe was controlled by the British Empire. Do you understand how insane that is? They went around colonizing from pillar to post. People didn't care about them. No one was trying to find the British. The British were the ones traveling the world, telling everyone of their existence, knocking on doors. Hey, we're British, follow us. I'm not saying the British are bad people, by the way. I understand that colonization was something that was popular at one time. Many European countries participated in it. But the British were the best. They colonized with class. They went all over the globe. In colonization, we read about it now, and it seems normal because it's in the history books. They colonize. But when you think about colonization, it's the strangest thing you can think about. Because conquering is one thing. You go to another country, you take what's theirs, you want more, you take the land, you take the resources, you kill the people. That I understand. I don't condone. I understand. But colonization is strange because you go there, you don't just take over, you then force the people to become you. That is such a strange concept when you think about where the British did it. They did it in Africa. They did it in Asia. And think about in India. Those cultures could not be more diametrically opposed. And out of nowhere, the British just decided to roll up. Imagine what the Indians must have felt like on that day, minding your own business, walking through a field. Next thing you know, the British show up on horseback. I'm going to skip the funny dialogue here that I'm not equipped to replicate, but it's a very good reason to actually go watch his special because it's hilarious. But then, many years later, the British, after they were done pillaging, they left and went home. And so it only stands to reason that those Indians, who they now had made British, would seek out the land from whence they came, in other words, Britain. So let's look at imperialism, colonialism, this weird thing that he's just described for us. And let's try to unpack the concept. First, by looking at its characteristics. Imperialism is the act of creating an empire, which means dominating another state politically and/or economically. And in this context, it describes a political ideology, so a system of ideas about what is right and good, that was followed by industrialized states, starting with Europe and the United States mostly, and eventually Japan too, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that encouraged them to control less developed areas of the world, especially in Africa and Asia, to get resources to fuel industrial production. Here's the connection with industrialization. Industrialization led to a big increase in demand for natural resources and raw materials, the stuff you need to power the machines and to make finished products, which is what the whole economy was about now. As more nations industrialized, there was more competition for these raw materials. And there came the idea, the conclusion, that having a big empire meant having the most power. So in addition to competing for raw materials, there was competition for colonies among the industrial Western states. Their solution to this problem of needing raw materials was to expand to get their resources, to go to other people's countries and take their stuff, in other words. And when we say resources, we mean stuff like iron and steel and aluminum, but also people and also the labor of the natives that they exploited. This act of expansion is called imperialism. And it was violent, it was racist, at times it was genocidal, and it went on for about a century, about 100 years. We're going to take notes on imperialism in several chunks. So go ahead and press pause here, get this down in your notes, and then press play again so we can look at different types of imperialism. Now, imperialism in this time period took several different forms. All empires were not the same. And so we're going to look at the different types that existed so we can recognize it when we see it. Remember, here we're defining imperialism as the act of creating an empire by dominating another state, either politically or economically or both. First, let's look at the most familiar type, formal imperialism. This is probably what you think about when you think about creating an empire. Formal imperialism means official political control. Like, I come to your country, I conquer you, I stick my flag in your state, and I own it now. It's what exists when one country establishes direct, like legal, political control over a territory as a colony or as a protectorate. And again, this is usually how empires that we've studied work. Like if I take over a part of the world, it's mine now. On a map, it shows up as belonging to me. The best example of formal imperialism for this period is the European colonization of Africa. And if you'll look at the pictures on the right, on the top right, you'll see how African kingdoms were kind of dispersed before. And on the bottom right, you'll see that they were basically almost entirely, with the exception of Ethiopia, which was called Abyssinia back then, and Liberia, conquered by European states. All of it. On the map, it showed up as belonging to them. The way Europeans ruled their new conquest types also. You had direct where European colonizers sent their people to their new colonies, Europeans, to rule the territory. You also had a separate option called indirect rule, which involved European colonizers letting local rulers handle the day-to-day government and administration, with a few European advisors to oversee them. So indirect rule meant ruling through people who were already there, ruling through the locals, the natives. As you can imagine, this caused a lot of resentment amongst the people who had been conquered. And the people who would agree to do this, who would agree to rule for the Europeans, might do it because it protected their privileged status or gave them privilege when they didn't have any before. For the colonizer, this is less expensive, easier, and it allows a lot of the anger that comes out of colonization to be directed at other people, not the Europeans, the locals that were ruling over the other locals. And if you're interested in looking at how destructive this can be, Rwanda is a fantastic and tragic case study of what can happen in the long run to societies that experience this form of colonization. Anyway, long story short, formal imperialism means conquering a place, claiming it as your own. And Africa is the best example of that. There is also a new form of imperialism that is a little trickier to get your head around. And that's okay. But we're going to try anyway. That's informal imperialism. Informal imperialism refers to economic domination of another state, usually. In this case, the imperial state, the European state, doesn't actually take over the country and claim it as its own, but instead it influences its behavior a ton, using indirect means, usually economic, but often with a lurking military threat to control this other nation or territory. It describes the spheres of influence that an empire might develop as a result of the extension of commercial, strategic, or military interests of the empire that translate into a huge degree of influence over a region that doesn't belong to it. There are many examples of this form of imperialism. In this class, we're going to look at the British domination of China as our case study. But next year, when you learn American history, you'll definitely learn about America's informal empire in Latin America. The forms that this can take are kind of different depending on the case, because this is more domination. It's not so cut and dry as like conquering a land and claiming it. It's more like being an international bully, like using your power to force other states to do what you want without having to take on the expense or the trouble of actually running their country. This takes the form of economic imperialism often, which describes how dominant powers establish economic power over developing countries. And it can describe spheres of influence, which mean an area of the world or of a country where one nation has control over trade and other economic activities. Describes the zone of influence of the stronger state. And again, we're going to be looking at China for our example of this, although there are others. There's also a separate related concept called gunboat diplomacy. A gunboat is a big boat with a lot of guns. And so this term describes pursuing foreign policy objectives with the help of really showy displays of power, which implies a threat of warfare if the other country doesn't do what you want. Basically, like sailing up a giant boat with lots of guns, pointing those guns at the country you want to influence, and asking them nicely to do what you want. You don't have to actually fire the guns for the threat to be effective. And our example for this is going to be America's attempt to imperialize Japan. Japan's going to be a really interesting case study because instead of actually falling victim to American imperial attempts, Japan very quickly realized that industrialization was necessary to remain strong and industrialized itself. And then, as industrial states tend to do, began to imperialize other countries as well. And that part of the story will take us pretty neatly through World War I and World War II, but we'll get there. So the difference between formal and informal imperialism can be kind of tricky. Formal means, official, you can see it on a map. Informal means just huge amounts of domination that don't necessarily show up in terms of like claiming another country. Falling back on my preferred way of explaining social concepts, I'm going to try to give you guys a metaphor using the school to illustrate the point, the difference between the two. So, the school is an empire, the principal is the queen, and she and the teachers are all British. The students are all a colonized people, just because it replicates the power dynamic that already exists. Under formal imperialism, teachers have formal power to direct your actions. We can tell you what to do, we can enforce rules by giving consequences like demerits, and enforce our demands on your actions through a disciplinary system that kind of looks like a legal document, tells you the rules and the consequences, and we apply those. The school belongs to the principal state. So that should be pretty clear and cut and dry. The different forms of ruling part of your formal empire can be thought of like this. For direct rule, there are teachers in every classroom to enforce rules. In other words, the principal herself isn't the person enforcing our code of conduct. She sends her people, the British, right? The colonizers, teachers, to every room to officially run the rooms. Indirect rule is something you've probably experienced. It's when I, the teacher, leave class for a bit and put a student, one of you, in charge of enforcing the rules in my absence. And this is a great metaphor because it creates exactly the kinds of tensions that exist when colonies use indirect rule. If that student, in fact, enforces my rules, other students in the class will resent that kid. It always happens, right? And that's just the way it is. And yet, the student who is enforcing my rules would probably get some benefits. I probably trust that student. I probably let that student do a few more things than the others. So that's formal imperialism, where the actual colonizer runs everything and it claims it as their own. Under informal imperialism, you can think of that more like having a school bully. A school bully has no formal authority over anybody. Their power over people is not spelled out in the code of conduct, but they can still influence your actions by the implicit threat of being punched in the face. So it's like a school bully telling you to give them your lunch money. They don't have to hit you for you to do it because you can imagine they might hit you, and if they're a bully, they're probably pretty effective. Economic imperialism is exactly this situation. The bully wants your lunch money. He has no official power to demand it, but you're going to give it to him anyway without him needing to have that kind of formal authority that a teacher might have. A sphere of influence can be thought about as the area of the school in which people do what the bully wants. And gunboat diplomacy can be thought of like asking for something while doing that, like, I'm going to hit you if you don't do this gesture with your hands. Like, there's no overt threat of violence. You don't have to say you're going to hit somebody, but it's pretty clear anyway. And so that enforces informal imperialism. As you take notes of these types of imperialism, like you're about to do, formal versus informal, direct versus indirect rule, my suggestion is to draw pictures because these concepts can show up pretty clearly in a picture in a way that tends to get lost in words, especially because they're kind of hard to articulate. They're hard to put into words. I'm going to show you two different slides. where you can take notes with these concepts. One of them is the chart that I just showed you with formal on one side and informal on the other. The other is the text that you might see in key points. So, however you want to do it, please get in your notes the definition of imperialism, the definition of formal imperialism, and that Africa is our example of that, the definition of informal imperialism and how it works, and that China is our example of that, and our exception to the rule. Just note that Japan was almost a victim of Western imperialism, but then industrialized and started conquering other places itself, following the pattern of industrialization leading to imperialism. So you can pause here if the text like this is helpful, or you can press play again and use this chart to get these concepts into your notes, ideally as a picture. Finally, a few recommendations. If this part of history is interesting to you, you could read King Leopold's Ghost, a fantastic book about the tragic colonization of the Congo. You could watch an episode of a wonderful show. It's called Anthony Bourdain Parts Unknown. And if you look up the episode where he goes to the Congo, you can actually see what the place is like now and how the imperial history kind of shaped the tragic parts. If you wanted to look at an example of how imperialism showed up at the time, especially for children, The Jungle Book was actually written by a British person from the perspective of a British person who had just colonized India, with like some racist subtext about needing to civilize it. Same with Babar. I don't know if American kids watch Babar, but I did when I was little. And it's all about an elephant from Africa and the process of making him more like a European, civilizing him so he can live in Paris. So, check some of those things out.